Good evening and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial Center. I'm Rebecca Steiner, I'm Director of Programs here, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the board and staff of the Holocaust Memorial Center. Each year, more than 85,000 visitors of every age, nationality, and religion pass through our doors. For many, it is their only introduction to the Holocaust. It is our mission to teach our visitors and the broader community so that they in turn become educators, bearing witness for the 11 million victims of the Holocaust, telling the world that the Holocaust should never, ever happen to anyone, anywhere. On the second floor of this museum is our library archive, which holds about 100,000 volumes that preserve the memory of the Holocaust and pre-Holocaust Europe, as well as Judaica. It is available to the public at no charge. You can go in and check it out any day just by walking in the doors. The Holocaust Memorial Center receives no state or federal operations funds and is supported entirely by the generosity of this community. So if we touch your lives, if we touch your hearts, I encourage you to make a small donation as much as you feel comfortable with. Every dollar, every penny is appreciated. So I would like to welcome you here tonight, as well as some very special guests, without whom this program would not be possible. A very special thank you to Dorothy and Herschel Sandberg, who are sponsors of this program, as well as our corporate sponsor, PNC Wealth Management. Heartfelt thanks also to the Michigan Humanities Council, whose initiative and creativity sparked a statewide discussion of the book, Annie's Ghosts, A Journey into a Family Secret, the book which brought us all here today. I would like to invite Eric Nordberg, Director of the Michigan Humanities Council, to the stage.
Well, thank you all. I know you didn't come to hear from me, but this event is actually an intersection of several different things. It's an intersection of events that are ongoing here at the Holocaust Memorial Center, which you are all aware of. It's an intersection with our program, the Great Michigan Read. Our goals with the Great Michigan Read are to engage Michigan residents in reading books by Michigan authors such as Steve Luxenberg, who you're going to hear today, or literature about the Great Lakes region. We look for a book every 2 years that we think can be a vehicle not only for reading but also for conversation. And for those, let's see, how many people here have read Steve's book, Annie's Ghost? As you can imagine, this week, while we're doing events in the Metro Detroit area, there's a great interest in the Detroit story, in the Jewish American story. As we've traveled this book around Michigan, all the way to the UP, the western part of Michigan, and up north, other people have been attracted to the elements of genealogy, family history, and a lot of interest, obviously, in community mental health, and how we in Michigan deal with mental health issues, both in history but also currently. That's really what we're about, is engaging those kinds of conversations so that all of you, so that all of us in Michigan can think more positively, more creatively about solutions to the problems that we all face as we go along. We have about 300 partner organizations this year. We could not run this program without them. That's schools, libraries, book clubs, right across Michigan, up and down, back and forth. The council provides copies of books to those partners. We have a reader's guide, a teacher's guide. I should also point out James Nelson and Kate Bartig, who are in the back here from the council as well. If you have questions about our program, don't hesitate to talk to them. There's also some literature on the back table. If you get the opportunity before you go, we'd also ask you to fill out one of the audience survey forms. These are very helpful for us in figuring out, okay, what worked with this program and what can we do next? I want to particularly thank the Holocaust Memorial Center for being a partner. We can't run this program ourselves. It's only through these partner agencies that actually host these events that reach into their audiences, which you are, that this program is successful. We have many partners in this area as well who've supported this, and at the state level we have significant partners like the Meyer Corporation and the Library of Michigan who helped to make this program run. So thank you very much for being here this evening. I know that you're not here to listen to me. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And at this time, I would like to ask you to help me in welcoming Tim Anderson, Senior Vice President and Wealth Director of PNC Wealth Management, to the stage.
I'll be even briefer because I know for sure you're not here to hear from me. It's funny, as I walked in and I talked with a number of you folks, I ran into a familiar face by the name of Mr. Yaker. He's out there in the audience. And it reminded me of what the fun part of this job is. It's an opportunity. Naturally, I want you to be aware of what PNC and PNC's Wealth Management Group, but it's really fun to be part of an organization where we can give back. And this is really very much in alignment with PNC's mission to be able to reach out to the community, to partner with the community, and it's really a lot of fun for me as a Huntington Woods kid who grew up and still lives in Huntington Woods, a mile and a half from the house I grew up in, to be able to be part of an organization, to see this organization grow, to be able to do business with this organization, and to continue to do business with many of the members who reminded me that they are PNC customers as well. So on behalf of PNC's Wealth Management Group, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing the story. There's a seat available here. I'm going to sneak in the back and sit in the back row because my wife's got dinner cooking for me. If I don't get home soon, she's going to be mad at me. But thank you for the opportunity, for being here, and I look forward to hearing the story. Bye-bye.
All right, the show must go on. So at this time, I'd like to invite Richard Bachmann, Steve Luxenberg, and Dana Nemeth to the stage.
Oh my, I'm excited. My name is Richard Bachmann, and as you can hear, I'm not from here, I'm from Germany. I'm a graduate student who is currently working here at the Holocaust Center through the Action Reconciliation Service for Peace program. Action Reconciliation Service for Peace is an organization from Germany that organizes for young Germans to volunteer in countries and communities that were harmed by Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. I have the pleasure tonight to host this conversation, a conversation between Steve Luxenberg, the author of Annie's Ghosts and associate editor of the Washington Post, and Dana Nemeth, who is the director of the Wood County Historical Center and Museum in Bowling Green, Ohio, which will host an exhibit about the asylum system later this month. Later on in the program, we're going to open up the floor to your questions, and you are encouraged to ask both Steve and Dana the questions you have in mind. Steve, to get us started on the conversation, and I saw a lot of hands raised when the question was asked, who read the book? But I guess not everybody in the room has read your book. Maybe you can briefly talk about what you present in Annie's Ghosts.
Well, I'd like to ask people who have not read it, what's wrong with you? So I guess one way to start is to say that I knew three things for sure about my mom when I was growing up. Her name was Beth, she was an only child, and she always told me to tell the truth. The first two aren't true. And her relationship with the truth was one that I decided to explore in a book. You know, in newsrooms, they'd say for accuracy, to stress accuracy, if your mother tells you that she loves you, check it out. My mother loved me very much, but I don't think she ever thought I would delve so deeply into her life. So essentially, very briefly, because there's much to discuss tonight, my mom was born in 1917. She died at the age of 82 in 1999. Annie, her secret sister, my mom is the secret keeper, Annie is the secret. She was born 2 years later in 1919 and died at the age of 53 in 1972. In 1995, we heard the first whispers that my mom had a sister we knew nothing about. I didn't quite believe it at the time, and because of the way that we heard about it, I didn't accept that I should ask my mom about it, because I was told that my mom was 4 years old, her sister was 2, and my mom had no idea what happened to her. So I kind of thought, well, you lose your sister at the age of 4 years old, you are an only child. I didn't learn until much later, after my mom had died, that my mom was 23 and Annie was 21 when she went into the institution called Eloise the nickname really, because it was called Wayne County General Hospital and Infirmary in its last years, but everybody in town who knows Eloise knows it by that name. I didn't learn that until after my mom had died, so I'd missed the opportunity for her investigative reporter son to start grilling her. I suppose she probably was happy about that. But I was trying to respect her privacy because she hadn't told us meaning her children. And so I thought, well, if she didn't know what happened to her sister and I wouldn't learn anything, what would be the point of bringing up what was probably an uncomfortable subject for her? I have a different answer today to that question than I did then, but I was very much the son in 1995, thinking that my mom had told the truth when she said I was only 4 years old and Annie was 2. Once I learned the truth was something different, would I go back and ask her those questions over again? Probably, but don't have that opportunity. So I took the readers of this book on a journey to find out, to try to understand and to put myself in my mom's place. Essentially, this is a book about identity, the identity that my mom reinvented for herself when she left the neighborhood where everybody knew Annie, the identity that Annie lost when she went into the institution because she essentially became anonymous, and the identity that I had inherited and now had to re-examine and ask myself about my own family. And that's as much as I think is necessary at this point.
Wow. In your book, you describe in great detail your attempts really to recover information about you and Annie, who was kept a family secret for so long. Could you describe a little bit how the research looked like and how it was for you to try to recover information, first of all, about your aunt, but also what happened when you found out about the story of Anna Olivek, who was a Holocaust survivor from this community and who is related to your family?
Well, as you said, I described in great detail, perhaps overwhelmingly frustrating, exhausting detail about my efforts to learn about Annie's life. I really can't say with any honesty that I can describe the daily life that Annie had. I can describe the arc of her life, but I didn't get the kind of records that I would be able to rely on to say what her life was like each day in the hospital where she spent 31 years. The story is partly a story about Annie. My motivation was partly to restore her identity to her. But it was also partly to stand in my mom's shoes. Now, it's important to say, my mom did not decide to send Annie to Eloise. That was my grandparents' decision. I know that my mom was knowledgeable about it and involved. She was the well-spoken, very smart daughter who could interface with the system that my immigrant, not very well-spoken grandparents had a hard time understanding. So I'm sure she was part of the discussions. Anna Olivek comes into the story because I and her son David, I think is maybe still here. David, are you here? In the back? David, my cousin. Very helpful to me. A cousin I never knew that I really had, although his mom says that we met when I was 2 years old and Anna would have been about, I guess, 45 or so. And we sat in a restaurant not far from here, and I wanted to know about my family secret and Anna's role in that. And Anna wanted to tell me how angry she was at my mom for keeping hidden the existence of a living person when Anna, this is my words more than Anna's, I suppose, had lost all of her relatives who of course related to me, but I didn't know that I had, lost them in the Holocaust. Anna survived by doing something quite extraordinary, which is by living a lie, by pretending that she was half German. She had papers that she had purchased to prove that, and she managed to convince the Nazis at the age of 18 that she was half German, and she became a translator for the Wehrmacht on the Russian front at the age of 18. And you can't pull that off if you're not able to live the lie. And that must have been a terribly traumatic experience for Anna at that age. So I meet her in the year 2006, and I'm very much the journalist at this point, trying to understand the story, but I found in that dinner that I became very much the son, as Anna kept telling me how bad a person my mother was. And I had to restrain myself to not defend my mom. And then I got home and I listened to the recording I had made of our interview, and I said, boy, didn't ask any of the questions you would have asked if you didn't know this woman. And that's part of the challenge of this story is that I couldn't deny that I was the son, I couldn't deny that I was the journalist. I had to embrace both roles and make it part of the story because it truly was part of the story. I told the story of Anna Olowiek's experience in one chapter in the book. It could be an entire story, a book on its own. It's a remarkable story.
Thank you. Maybe as a little side note to you, because today we will also talk about the importance of historic preservation that institutions like the Holocaust Center does and the Wood County Historical Center and Museum. There's a project, it's called Portraits of Honor, Michigan's Holocaust Survivors. And Anna Olowiek is a Holocaust survivor who lived in this community. And you can go on a website, which is called Portraits of Honor, and you can find out more about Anna's particular story, but also about the story of other Holocaust survivors in the region. And we actually have printed out Anna's Portraits of Honor passport, and it will be available at the desk in the back of the room, and I encourage you to take a look at it when you exit the room. But now I also, this is not just a conversation between me and Steve, I also would like to ask Dana a question. And you are the director of the Historical Center in Bowling Green, Ohio, which is really a key institution in preserving a community's history. And could you comment a little bit maybe on the importance of historic preservation? Why is it important? And why is it important for people like Steve that do research on their family, but also really research on the community they grew up in?
Well, when I hear historic preservation, I think of buildings, but I think you can also consider historic preservation being about preserving documents and artifacts, and that's what museums and archives are all about. Most historic buildings in our nation, as you know, are because of a famous person possibly living there or something famous happening at that site. The significant thing about my site is that we are located on what was once the county's poor farm. Very similar to what Eloise served as, but we're a much smaller rural community, so it was now nowhere near as big a facility. But the building is still standing where the people lived, and we have many of the original outbuildings that were used as the working farm still standing, one of which is the lunatic asylum that in Ohio law in the 1880s, the state ruled that every county should have an asylum to house the mentally ill in their community. So ours was built, the facility was built in 1868, and the asylum was built in the 1880s, and it served in that function until the early 1900s, when the state legislation changed yet again and ordered that the mentally ill would be housed in state-run institutions. So after that time, the local community and the county infirmary, you'll hear me call it infirmary, poorhouse, working farm, it went by different names. County home was the last kind of name it really went by, but the local community would house possibly the mentally ill on that site for a night or two or days until that person could be transported to a mental health facility. So how do you preserve history about someone who was incapable or possibly never given the opportunity to record their life story? And that's something we face with the people that lived and died at the site where we're located. So what you need to do is look to public records. And I know Steve did that in some of his research as well. Since we were a county-run facility, the county did keep records for them. And Bowling Green State University is located in the same community where our museum is. And they have a Center for Archival Collections, which is a regional depository for state public records and county records. So because of that being located in a nearby, those records were transferred from the county courthouse and the county records center to this archives, because they really did consider those as historic records. Those records no longer had to be kept for any fiscal or legal or administrative reason, but because the archives existed, I think that's why these records were saved. So we rely on those records to try to help tell the story of the people that lived and worked at our site. And again, kind of like Steve mentioned, when you get beyond living memory of people who may have lived there or worked there, you need to rely on the public record to find out what their daily life may have been like.
Are those records open?
They are. Unlike yours, there's very little information in them that I would say would have been health related. Those records probably were destroyed at some point. So if you're looking for information about a person who lived there and don't have any relatives living that knew that person, the only thing you're going to be able to find in our records would be a record of admission. So it would list the person's name, who dropped them off, why they were no longer to be able to live independently, and then you might have a notation if someone picked them up. Not necessarily the one that went there, lived there forever, but there would also be notations then also if they died, and if they were buried on our site, we also have a pauper cemetery, or if they were buried elsewhere. So you can at least verify the facts about when they were there and how long, but beyond that, you're not going to find much information about the individuals.
Steve, how can you relate to what Dana just said? I mean,
Well, first of all, I have to say that I want to go over and hug Dana, because I do work all the time in research, and I love libraries. I love archives. In fact, when I call a government office, I often ask to speak to the archivist, because once you're transferred to the record management person, anybody here in records management? I don't want to hug you. They have totally different missions. An archivist is trained to preserve records and, when possible under law, to allow them to be examined. A records management person is often trained to say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have that. It's just a different, I'm being jocular, but it is a different function. Libraries and archives do something that is really important in our society, which is to allow us to tell the story of ourselves. And in the state of Michigan, those records, even at that minimal level that you described, do not exist in a public way for most mental health patients.
Do you really think that's because of the records managers being
No.
more in charge of it?
No, I don't. I don't think it has anything to do with the records. It has to do with the state law about confidentiality of medical
Okay.
records and psychiatric records. And I feel that there's a coming conflict here, because in the last 25 years in particular, we have exalted privacy, which is, of course, not only a right that we revere, but one that we should. But it's going to come in conflict with families as they want to learn more about their family backgrounds, as the society learns more about the genetic and other reasons for physical and mental illnesses. We're going to want to know more about our past, not less. The digitization of records, of course, makes it cheaper for states and counties to preserve records. Preserving records in paper form is quite expensive, climate controlled, et cetera. So, there's been good reasons why records haven't been maintained. I think that we're coming into an age where there's not a lot of good reasons why they shouldn't be maintained. But we also ought to re-examine why we keep records private or confidential that are 80 to 100 years old, when everybody involved with that person or that case is now dead, to me, that all that does is to perpetuate the very stigma surrounding mental health that we would like to get rid of. And I would open those records to family members. I wouldn't open them necessarily to the public as much as a journalist would like to say that they should be, but I would definitely open them to family members.
Yeah, I think you hit on a good point, the difference between record managers and archivists, because archivists are the ones that are trained to recognize if a record is historic, if it has historic value beyond what the record manager might recognize. And in our instance, that is what happened. The county records manager transferred those records to this archives. But, you know, I agree with you about the privacy being an issue. I think when it gets to the point where you're digging down as an individual doing genealogy research, your argument makes sense. I think in other cases, I've helped researchers who might be doing more of a statistical analysis of the data. And in those instances, I don't think the records should be kept, but possibly redact the names. But because the information they want isn't so much about the human being, it's more.
They don't want the personal story.
Right. They want to be able to analyze the data and, you know, hopefully come up with some new information to share as well. You know, I think their research is noble too, just in a different way. Yep. So I don't know enough about the laws between Ohio and Michigan to really know the difference.
Well, all states are different, you know, as you know. And there are states, I know that there are mental health records that are preserved in Columbus that are part of the Ohio Historical Society's records by law. That wouldn't have to be the case, but that happens to be the repository for some of those records. In other states, I mean, there's a very well-known woman who is in charge of immigration records in Washington, and she was furious that she couldn't get records on her great-grandmother in Pennsylvania. Her great-grandmother was in an asylum in Pennsylvania. And she just found it frustrating. Here I am trying to preserve records myself, and I'm arguing with the state of Pennsylvania about how I can't get them.
Yeah, our records, I would say, are sporadic. We do have two census of idiots is what they were called, which did list the people living in the asylum in the early 1900s. I assume they took that census right before they moved them to the state-run facilities. That's being treated like a public record.
Let's pause on that word for a minute, because I think it's important to understand its place in the law. I was recently, not too long ago, watching Governor Chris Christie in his bridge fiasco. And it brought up the whole issue of how Governor Christie likes to call people out in public. And he'll say something like, "You're an idiot for asking that question." And the CBS News reporter who was interviewing him said, "You know, Governor Christie, do you think it's appropriate for you to use that language?" And he said, "I just call it like I see it." And I thought to myself, do you have any understanding of where that word came from? And it came from the fact that the law in Michigan, this was a legal designation of the stages of retardation. That was also the word that was used then. Idiot, imbecile, moron. And, you know, idiot was actually better than moron. But those words leached from the language. Words are, you know, we grapple with this all the time. Today, we talk about developmental disabilities. I'm sure that there'll be some other phrase that we use 40 years from now. We grapple with words all the time. It's a very important thing. So I would hope that the governors of states would understand that when you're using those kinds of words, they came from somewhere that was something we've decided to change, and that we shouldn't be using them so cavalierly.
I wanted to ask both of you about something that you kind of already touched upon, which really is the distinction between oral family history and the records that are available, so to say, the public records that list certain historical facts. And first of all, Dana, maybe, how do museums deal with that? Having the records there, but then also having people coming in and from their families know the story quite differently. And also, Steve, maybe, what was it for you like to confront your own family members with what you found in the archives?
First of all, you need to know the name of the person and that they actually existed and lived there. We do have 4 journals that list everyone admitted into the institution from 1868 until 1956, and that's indexed. So how do you find information about someone you don't know exists? I think you do something like Steve, where you have to find people that maybe know a family secret, and the further away you remove yourself in the family from the secret, the more likely they're going to be a willing informant to you, because they don't necessarily have anything personal at stake. And I think all of us have stories in our families that we can relate to in that sense, where for instance, my great aunt was married and her first husband died in World War II, and she remarried, and her son never knew that his mother had another husband. And why do I know that? And this man grew up and didn't know that secret about his own mother. So I think usually by the time people get to our site, they know that they had a relative that lived there at some point. So they're able to use that information. I think when the museum opened in 1975, in the mid-1980s, they got a grant from the Ohio Humanities Council to do oral histories with people that lived there. I don't think they actually interviewed anyone, that worked there. I don't believe that they interviewed anyone that actually lived there. But we do have these interviews now that can document personal stories and stories about specific individuals that lived there from the 1940s up till the 1970s when it closed. So anything before the 1940s, we don't have a story about these individuals like you mentioned. So again, I think even with oral histories, it's not just that. Even information you might find on Ancestry or other online genealogy sites, you do have to question the authenticity of that. So I think it can give you clues, these kind of tools, but it's a public record or the written record that you need to go back to verify, oh, she wasn't 4 when she was put into the institution. She was actually 21, because family stories have a way of changing and misinformation.
Yeah, very much so.
And memory, if you're a young person, your memory about a situation will be different than what maybe actually occurred.
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about how records are created and why, and they have limitations, as we know. You mentioned not kept for administrative or fiscal reasons. Governments don't create records so that we can tell stories 100 years later.
Right.
They create the records for their own purposes, and we then plumb those records for clues about the stories of people's lives. Oral histories are, I think, significantly important in preserving those stories, with the very large caveat that you so wisely put out, which is that they may not be actually true. Although they often are true.
Yeah.
And much of them are true. But like the Shoah project that Steven Spielberg initiated, I think I'm correctly saying he initiated it. So there are thousands of people who survived the Holocaust who had a chance to tell their story, and those records are now preserved. I was fortunate enough to go to California, to the home of the Shoah project, to listen to the stories of 3 people who came from the town, Radziwiłów, where David's mother was living when she fled and managed to survive the Holocaust, where my grandparents left before World War I. They were not involved in the Holocaust. So that I could understand by listening to people who were actually there, because Anna left. She got away before the massacres occurred. These were 3 people who were there when they occurred, and I wanted to listen to their stories so that I could help fill in Anna's story. I didn't necessarily believe everything that I was hearing, but I could get a sense of that. And of course, I could then go and use public records, if they existed, to confirm, as you said. So I think it's an important thing that this trend toward oral history is is a supplement to the public records that we're talking about.
The other thing is oral histories can reflect even the social mores and beliefs that they had that might change in looking back 20, 30 years now at some of the comments that workers made about the people that live there, I think would be politically incorrect at this point. So we've had some old exhibits where I've taken it down because I didn't like how the workers were portraying some of the people that live there. I thought it was disrespectful. But even 30 years ago, that was apparently okay for them to comment on people less fortunate than them that way.
Well, that's an interesting distinction because in the records that I managed to get, the few records on my aunt's admission to Eloise, the social worker, who I think was quite a good social worker and was quite candid in her evaluation, she said some things that we would regard today as perhaps being disrespectful. She called my grandmother that whiny Jewish woman. Well, you know, I really liked the fact that she called her a whiny Jewish woman because that captured she didn't say that all Jewish women were whiny, but she was capturing my grandmother in the moment and how she was relating to the system. I might not have used the word whiny, which has a connotation, but I like the idea that she was being candid about that. You know, I think that memory is such a tricky, I love writing about memory because I think it's such a tricky subject. And one of my favorite stories that's not in my book, because it has nothing to do with my book, is about Lincoln's watch. Does anybody know the story of Lincoln's watch? So the Smithsonian had a watch that for years and years, they just knew to be the president's watch. Meanwhile, there was another story that was floating, another narrative about a Lincoln watch, a pocket watch we're talking about, that had on the inside an inscription that said, because the watchmaker who was repairing the watch put this in, could you imagine writing this on this small, but what he wrote was, "War has begun, slavery is dead, thank God we have a president who will try." Now, how do we know that's what he wrote? Because in 1906, he told the New York Times that that's what he wrote on the inside of this watch. Now, we know newspapers to be a good contemporaneous source for information. This wasn't contemporaneous because it was 1906, and everybody who had ever had anything to do with Lincoln was being interviewed about their memories of Lincoln. Well, a genealogist in Illinois persuaded the Smithsonian to open up the watch. And you can imagine how nervous the Smithsonian must have been. We're going to open up this antique watch, but they did. Great photo opportunity. They opened up the watch, and sure enough, there was an inscription. It didn't resemble at all what the man had said.
Right.
First thing he wrote was his name, because like all of us, we want a byline. The second thing he said was, and think about why the three sentences could not have been true. On April 14th, 1861, they didn't know it was going to be a war. So he wrote what they knew. Sumter bombed. That's all he wrote. Sumter bombed. And then he said, thank God we have a government. So slavery wasn't dead because no one considered it a war for slavery. And of course, slavery wasn't dead because it wasn't dead yet. And most importantly, Abraham Lincoln was a rail-splitting doofus from Illinois. He was not a guy you would say, thank God we have that president.
Right.
So as a historian, I knew that these three sentences couldn't be true, but in 1906, that's what the New York Times wrote.
I really like what you just said about the problems of oral history, but also really the potential. And I can relate that very much to some research that I did, namely about the Jewish community in the area where I grew up. And talking about the public record and oral history projects, I found an interview on the internet, Googled and my town's name and found an interview by a Holocaust survivor from the small town where I went to school at. And listening to him, having this very personal level really, it's quite something else, at least to me, than only studying the historical facts. really. And I think both of you made that very clear. Dana, your example about also the problems, really, the authenticity of oral history. What do you do when you think that the language that was used by the people you interviewed is not appropriate anymore? But at the same time, also really having them speak, having their voice, really having their perspective. And I think, Steve, that is something that you really try to deal with in your book. And you mentioned that before about trying to reestablish really an identity that is taken away from a person. And I was just wondering, when you did your research and in your book you describe you talk to family members. Of course, it's the first thing that you do, I guess, when you do research on your family. And then you went to the archives. And how was it for you to find quite different perspectives on what your family members told you about your family, and trying to reconcile these perspectives, but also confront your family members really with what you found?
Well, fortunately, all of my siblings, who are the main family members who were alive when I was doing my research, none of us knew anything, so I didn't have to reconcile anything with them. They were all in the same boat that I was in. My favorite moment, I know you're asking a serious question, but I have to share this. My favorite moment was my Uncle Manny, who told me when I had interviewed him that he was not at my parents' wedding because he was in the service in World War II, and he wasn't able to get there, and how sad he was about this. And then I unearthed a photograph in which I saw Uncle Manny. And I showed it to him, and he said, "If you hadn't shown it to me, I would not have believed that I was there." So, I'm glad I didn't write that Uncle Manny had skipped my parents' wedding. But the more difficult thing was, there was a moment in which I was interviewing somebody who lived in the neighborhood who knew Annie, and who wished that she had paid more attention to Annie because she was a kid and Annie kind of intimidated her. And I'm telling her in 2006, well, that was a different time and a different place, and we know much more now about people with a disability. Annie, for those of you who don't know, because we've been talking about mental health, Annie was born with a deformed leg that never straightened out, and she was given crutches and braces throughout her childhood until the age of 16, when the leg was amputated. It was amputated in order, I think, truly to give her a stable platform on which to walk, because her leg had atrophied, and she wasn't really able to get around very well on those crutches or braces. She was given a wooden leg, and that was its own difficulty, but it was, I think, probably a step up from where she had been before. Because she had this deformity, I think that for the first 16 years of her life, that much of that attention was focused on her physical problem because it was so visible. It was something that prevented her from going to school until she was 8 years old. And then she went to, talking about offensive language, she went to the Leland School for Crippled Children, and then she went to the Oakman School for Crippled Children. Today, if you would like to visit the Oakman School, it's called the Oakman Elementary and Orthopedic School, still here on Detroit's west side, and you can walk the hallways that Annie walked, and I walked them, and you can see the polished mahogany railings that go down the sides of the hall so that somebody with a crutch or a brace can hold on to that mahogany railing and walk. And I described this scene of going there. And talk about memory, Richard. I went to this school thinking that I was kind of on a fool's errand. Mm-hmm. That Annie would not only not be there, but there would be no record of her. And there was no record of her. When I went into the office and I said, "Do you happen to have any records from the 1930s?" And of course, they didn't, and thought that I was a little nuts. But I was wrong. She was there. Going there made me realize that watching the other children who in 2006, because it was still serving, 1/3 of the population was orthopedic, because it was still serving that, I did see Annie there in my mind's eye. And that's a different kind of history. So that visit was a valuable visit as a part of my research. And I didn't appreciate that until I'd actually gone there.
I think going back to historic preservation, the meaning of place, we've had people come to visit the museum who know their relatives had lived there, and it's more just to experience being in the same space that they once shared. I remember a woman came, her mother lived there, and this woman was actually born there and had been adopted. Her mother, if I remember correctly, had as a child had fallen and hit her head, so she wasn't able to care for a child. So she gave the baby up for adoption. And this woman does remember going and visiting her birth mother at the poorhouse. But she wanted to be there again and as an adult and be in the same space to give herself perspective. Mm-hmm. And there is something about the old woodwork and everything. One of the stairwells in our building is very worn down in the middle from all the hundreds of thousands of steps, that people that lived there over 100 years created those steps to look so worn. And that's something you can't experience listening to a story or reading a letter or a diary. There is something about the sense of place and being where these things happened.
And I mean, this is also central in your book, Steve, right? You talk a lot about the old neighborhood in Detroit where your mom and Annie grew up. And after reading that, really, you named the streets. I also went down there and because I wanted to see it. And you are totally right. It's quite something else. It's a quite different perspective than having the records there and even having the voice of a person there that tells something about that. And that, to me, was also so haunting when I listened to the oral history interview done by the Holocaust survivor from my community, basically, because the places he talks about are places that I know. The streets are still around. Some of the buildings are still around. And I actually found out that a building that I've passed many, many times on my way to school, which had a sign above the door that said Motolsky, and it was a store. But I knew that the people who own the store today are not Motolskys. They have a different name. Through his interview, I found out that Motolsky was the name of the Jewish family that used to own that store. And the store was taken away from them. They were deported and actually murdered in Auschwitz. This man is the only survivor of that small Jewish community of 13 people. And when you realize something like that, I mean, you can read about it, but I went back and stand in front of that building, and all of what he said came back to me, and all that very abstract, these very abstract things that you find in the records and in history overall. And it overwhelmed me. It was really overwhelming to have something like that.
Isn't it interesting that the name still survives?
Yeah. It was actually restored.
It could have been taken down.
Right. The sign was hidden for over 50 years. And when they restored the building in the 1990s, they recovered the old sign because the German who took over the store from Motolsky didn't remove the sign, just put his sign right above it and said, "This is my store now." And you know how things like that happened in Germany. And when they were kind of like renovating the building, they found that old one and they preserved it. But there was nothing there that would tell you what that actually means. You know, it was just one of those old store signs that you sometimes see on old buildings, and you have no connection to that. But through the oral history, I suddenly was able to establish this connection.
Well, the evocation of a name like that, just a name, you think about how important names are to us. We put them on gravestones, we say them in prayers after people have passed away. Names really make a difference. So when I received that cemetery letter, and I didn't receive it, my brother did, that revealed that there were three graves in the cemetery and not two. In 2000, we received this letter that had been sent to my mom, but was forwarded on when she had died to my brother. And suddenly Annie, this 2-year-old who I knew nothing about, had a name. And like you, because I knew about the 2-year-old, and I knew that Annie meant something, that she was a real person, that really mattered to me. I could now envision an Annie. I couldn't envision an unnamed 2-year-old. And so even something simple like the preservation of a name can invoke so much in us.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, and when you don't have those items, I think your museum, for instance, I just walked through your amazing exhibit. There are ways museums can try to create those environments so you can understand what it may have been like to be in that situation or in that space. So I think that's something that museums are doing a better and better job at trying to create within their exhibits, to not only share the artifacts and the documents and contextualize those, but actually create experiences where you might be able to have that kind of feeling and walk away with that memory.
Well, you know, for me, as a writer, I have a little, it's a now very worn, sun-bleached piece of paper on my desk, but it just lists the 5 senses, because those are the elements that I need to be able to tell the stories that I think matter. The touch, the feel, the smell. And when I'm reading a piece of a document in an archive, and they say, this is what it smelled like that day, or, you know, I was walking along and there was smoke coming out of the chimney, I give a little silent cheer, because that's the way I think we experience things when we walk around. And without that, it becomes a cold, lifeless kind of scene. But we need those tactile, oral, you know, smelling kind of things to be able to evoke the real life that people had.
Well, it's funny you say that, because the 2 books I have in the back seat of my car are your book and the Multisensory Museum. So that would have to be another topic here. But yeah, I think museums are recognizing, try to bring those into
unfortunately, sometimes people, like right now I'm working on something where I really need people to talk about what it was like on railroad trains that they were riding. And to them it was commonplace, so they didn't do it. They didn't say what it was like.
Right.
I'm thinking, come on, tell me something about the people that are sitting next to you. No, I took the train at 7 and got there at 11. Well, thanks very much. I could have looked that up in the newspaper.
Dana, maybe as a last question to you before we open up the floor and encourage you to ask questions. Your museum, the Wood County Historical Center and Museum, will feature an exhibit called Asylum Inside the Closed World of State Mental Hospitals. Could you maybe briefly talk a little bit about the upcoming exhibit there? What made you decide to do an exhibit like that? And what do you expect maybe the people who come to take away from that exhibit?
Because of our lunatic asylum being on our site, it is part of our mission to share the story of the history of treatment of mental illness. Our Historical Society restored the lunatic asylum 10 years ago and created an exhibit. So we're marking the 10th anniversary and unveiling a new exhibit in the asylum that's actually called Chasing the White Rabbit. That's going to be in our permanent exhibit. Our curator approached me about sponsoring or hosting this traveling exhibit called Asylum Inside the Closed World of State Mental Hospitals. It's a collection of photographs taken by New York photographer Christopher Payne, and he went around the country and took photographs of abandoned state mental hospitals. There's exteriors and interiors, and he captures how those buildings looked when they were abandoned, and they're very, very moving pictures. So we felt that that was a good complement to the exhibit we were opening in our lunatic asylum, and the Ohio Humanities Council provided a matching grant to us to be able to host that exhibit. So the photography exhibit's in our main building, and it will be open up through mid-November. So if you can't make it for the opening, we're only an hour and a half drive away. So I encourage you to come down and see the exhibit. They're beautiful pictures. And on May 31st, then, to mark the 10th anniversary, we're having a panel discussion about the history and treatment of mental illness over time, as well as having our local mental health advocates and social services have a mental health fair, and also talk about how the needs of mental health can be met in our community now. So our hope is by this program and these two exhibits is that we can educate people about what mental illness is and what treatment options are available, try to take away the stigma of it. Unless you have someone in your own life who suffers from mental illness, you might only know about that from popular culture. So that's our goal, is to educate the people and hopefully even make them advocates in their own community, whether it's in Wood County or elsewhere, to support mental health initiatives.
Steve, maybe I said one last question to Dana, but maybe how can you relate to what Dana just said?
Well, I was sitting here listening to you and thinking about how what you're doing complements what the Michigan Humanities Council is doing so well. And what has happened with the Great Michigan Read, and for those of you who don't know, Eric talked very briefly as was appropriate. But he could have talked much longer. I'm going to do it for him. So the Great Michigan Read picks a book every 2 years, as he said, but it's an opportunity for the entire state to engage in a conversation and to connect to those topics in the book. And I feel so honored that they chose my book, because they could have chosen a dozen other books that by great Michigan writers that came out in the last 5 years. And of course, if you go back another 40 years, they could have chosen any number of other ones. But I've been able to go all around the state, and I know that the mental health community has embraced the book because they feel that it's an opportunity to have a discussion that often takes place within their community, but does not take place in the wider community. And that's exactly what I think that your museum is doing by having these two exhibits. For me, the conversations that we've had, I'm looking at the slideshow. I mean, that's a piece of history too. Should we preserve that PowerPoint? I mean, everything that you do you can possibly preserve it. And of course, we don't have time, space, room, or space in our heads for all of the things that are created every time you do a talk. But I really do believe that the Humanities Councils of Ohio, of Michigan, throughout the state, these are the organizations that are helping us tell the stories of our lives. And that's why I think they deserve our support. And that's why I think the Great Michigan Read program, which is just one of 6 or 7 that the Humanities Council does, is such an important program.
I feel very honored because I did create this piece of history here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I encourage you now to ask the questions that you have for Steve and for Dana. I'll give away that microphone now, and it's yours.
Didn't Richard do a very nice job? Let's hear it for Richard. Who has a question they'd like to ask? Stand up, please.
This is a question for Richard. We talk about family secrets. I'm sure coming from your environment as a young German, there were a lot of families who had family secrets that they kind of buried under certain layers of so forth that they didn't want to talk about. Did this affect you personally? Did you know people that it did affect? And what comment do you have about that?
It's interesting that you asked this question because I was just thinking about that really. In a lot of German families, there are secrets. There are people being kept secret, namely the people who were directly involved in what the Nazis did. There were soldiers, there were maybe even in the SS, there were high-ranked officials. And I have to say, in my family, that was never really an issue. My family is very open when it comes to that. My grandfather was in the army. He was an SS soldier, actually. And it was never hidden from us children. But I know from friends, really, that with their families it's quite something else. And doing research, genealogy, could be very painful when it comes to that, because you might discover something that is quite different from what you heard your grandmother, for example, talk about, that shows a very different picture of a person, namely your grandfather, that you think you know and relate to. And I'm in the process myself of finding out more about my grandfather, and so far there have been a lot of dead ends really, but I was also able to acquire some new information. But it's very complicated. So in an abstract kind of way, I could relate very much to what you talk about in your book, which is also really recovering an identity. And for me, it's my grandfather's identity, especially when it comes to his involvement in Nazi Germany and the SS.
On my way. Can you stand, please?
Hi, this is for Steve. Steve, first of all, I just want to say I loved how you let the tale unfold. It was like this beautiful ball of yarn unwinding, and you let things come and keep going, and that was a really beautiful way to tell the book. But the one thing I keep wondering is, did you ever find a picture of Annie? That's, you know, you get to the end of the book, there's no picture. Were you ever able to locate a picture of her?
Unfortunately, no. I have collected more stories about Annie, and if we had another hour, I could tell you those stories. But I know that a photograph was taken when she was admitted to Eloise. Unfortunately, the records I received did not include that photograph, and I wasn't able to get any other records that might have been there. I hunted through more families' albums, stalked more families than I'd like to shake a stick at, and I just don't think a photograph was ever taken of Annie. If she lived today, I suppose there would be many selfies that somehow got made. But in that era, you know, cameras, as I wrote in the book, film was expensive. I don't think candid photographs got made, except finally, I think in the 40s, by the time Annie was going into Eloise, more people were taking candid photographs. I wish I could have seen a picture of her. I've had more people now describe to me what they saw of her, what she looked like. But isn't it interesting how important that is to see a photograph of somebody, and how that's part of this? You know, we've talked about oral histories, we've talked about other kinds of records, but photographs are a very important history, document in history too.
Hi, question for Steve. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I guess I was a little bit surprised with how gentle and generous you were in the treatment of your mother, and just wondering if you had to work through some forgiveness issues with her.
You know, I really didn't. You may be surprised by that, but I was asked in an interview after the book came out why I wasn't angrier at my mother, which was a much harsher way of asking the same question that you asked. And I like the way you asked that question, the idea of forgiveness. But I never thought this story was about me. I never thought that my mom created the secret because of me. And yes, she hid it from me eventually. But to make that the center of the story would be, I think, terribly self-indulgent. And so I tried to be the good historian, you know, to see the world through her eyes. To my mind, this is a book of understanding and not a book of judgment. Now, does that mean I let my mom off the hook? No, I think she made a terrible decision to create that secret and to keep it for so many years. But it wasn't because of me. It was terrible for her. It was a burden for her. And to forgive her, and I think at the end of the book, you hear a little bit of my forgiveness. It's to forgive her so that she can be open with her children and she can withstand the apparent judgment that she thinks she's going to endure, which I think she would not have. That's what she needed to be forgiven for making a bad choice. But I don't think the story is about me, so I never felt that anger that was kind of implicit in your question.
My question is for Steve, too. I heard something about that there was some talk about a movie of your aunt, Anna Olawick. I don't know if there's anything on that at all, but somebody had mentioned that to me.
Well, there's been various, there's currently a movie being made about Eloise, which got announced a couple of weeks ago. I don't have any knowledge about that movie. I think it's a good Hollywood story. There was, David, was it an audio recording that your mom did in 1982? There's an audio recording that Anna Olowick did with NPR in 1982. But there's no, I did receive some tentative inquiries about whether, from producers who might like to make, just two, make the book into a movie. I have to tell you, I'm quite nervous about that prospect because as much as we all have stars in our eyes, I would not like to see this story distorted into, I was telling somebody earlier today that the satire that was done by that group that does movies like Best of Show or whatever, there's a scene in which there's some producers talking to a Jewish family, and they're really excited about telling their story, but they have some ideas. They want to change a few things. We plan to make Hanukkah into Christmas. Well, I don't think it would be quite that bad, but I worked very hard to try to get to the truth of this story as best as I could, and I'm not sure that I would like to see the Hollywood version of that. So no movie that I know of, but if there's a producer in the audience, please come talk to me.
For Steve, it was interesting for me to find out how many of the people who were in Eloise at first were poor people, people who were there because they had no other place to be. And it made me think about the comments that I hear now about people who are on the street who are not housed in facilities because the facilities have been cut back. What do you think about that?
Well, that's the challenge of this era. When the asylum era ended and we shifted from a system that, under Michigan law, patients in 1940 were owed care and treatment. The standard now is that someone goes into a psychiatric facility if they are a danger to themselves or to others, which is a much stricter standard, obviously. And patients have much more rights today than they did then, so a patient can refuse treatment, including medication that might be helpful to him or her. And yes, I do think that some of the people who today are living without a home under an expressway, or who might have committed a minor crime and are in a jail, where they might be in a segregated floor, as they are in Miami, Chicago, and Los Angeles. That's our burden of this era and how we are dealing with the mental health issues. You had asked about the poor people. Dana kind of alluded to this when she said that originally the Wood County facility was a poorhouse. Eloise was originally a poorhouse, and then it became an asylum. And it did serve the indigent. You didn't have to be indigent if you went there, but mostly that's the population that it served. In Michigan, Eloise was the only county hospital, and it was kind of a parallel system to the state. The state reimbursed Eloise for their patients who had been there longer than 1 year on the theory that if the hospital didn't exist, those patients would have been the responsibility of the state. There was no other county hospital in the state of Michigan, and people who had means, and we know this today, people who have means today, they might seek their own form of care, and they have more options than people who are poor. We have somebody. I'm not going to. You should pick people. Oh.
Steve, I've got a comment. I want to thank you and everybody else involved, but Myers especially, because every time I go into Myers, I pick up the book. And I read a passage. So recently, I picked up the book.
Are you doing this out loud?
If I have an audience, I do. But I picked it up recently, and I was reading a passage where my mother's picture happens to be. And I felt she pretty diplomatically was telling you her feelings about your mother. Now, I know it's sort of brutally honest, but my mother can be very brutally honest. And I think I realized she didn't want you to look at your mother in a bad light. And you interviewed my mom for a great length of time, so I don't know what all she said. But that struck me because, to me, she was real brutally honest and people involved in my life. But that said, my mother always did say, your mother was a brilliant woman. And I think the two of them had that in common. So I noticed in that conversation how well my mom danced around that. So hopefully you saw it the same way.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you.
Making my way around. A couple more questions before we wrap up. Stand up, please.
Hi, I think it's, the lady's name is?
Dana.
Dana, either of you really, but I grew up in the backyard of Eloise, and I don't know if everybody here knows how immense that place was. When it finally was closed in the 80s, it just covered, literally acres of land with huge buildings. It was just unfathomable. And now what's left of it is kind of in ruins, but there has been a museum in there of the asylum, and I've been in there. We walked through a couple of years ago, and then we were told it was closed, and it's kind of a shame. Now, you say there's going to be a film about it, but
I want to tell you that you're in luck.
Okay.
It's been closed because they're going to reopen it under the aegis of the Westland Historical Commission, and it's going to be a much better space.
Great. Oh, good.
And some of the artifacts that were there were on loan to Jewish Family Service this afternoon, and were at the lunch that I was at earlier today. And it was really interesting how people saw those artifacts who have never been to the museum that you talked about, because they had no staff, they had no hours. Nobody knew it was there. The Westland Historical Commission is going to do what museums need to do, which is to make people aware that this history is available to them.
My question is, when Annie went into Eloise at the age of 21, what was her diagnosis?
There was no diagnosis. Are you shocked by that? There was no diagnosis because under Michigan law, none was required. What was required is that two physicians had to examine her. They had to declare her, in the form, actually insane. That is not a diagnosis, that's a statement. Later on, she was diagnosed with undifferentiated chronic schizophrenia. That was what was on her death certificate. She was exhibiting paranoid tendencies. She didn't want to leave the house, she didn't want to bathe. When she went outside, she refused to step off of the curb. She would stand for half an hour. This is my grandmother's description to the social worker, which is included in her routine history. I do think she had a mental health issue. I do think she needed help and treatment. But the two physicians disagreed about whether she should be institutionalized. And so they called in a third physician who broke the tie in favor of the institution. She became a custodial patient, meaning that she spent her entire life there. I don't know that I don't know what I would call her disorder when she entered the hospital. By the time she left, she had a diagnosis. And that's the best that I can do for you.
Last question.
I have a question. I just wonder how you could write, or if you were ever troubled by the fact that people might not like your mother or might have a difficult time understanding her. I can't say I liked your mother. Did that ever, trouble you in writing the book?
Absolutely troubled me, in part because I liked my mother. She was a kind, loving, generous person who raised a wonderful family. I wanted you to know that, and I'm a little troubled that you didn't feel that way after you read the book. But that's why I included the sections that are in italics that are sort of my memory of my mother, because I feared that if I went on a journey to find out about my mother's secret, that you would see her only in the dimension of being the secret keeper. And that would be all she was to you. She wasn't that to me. And people have asked me, well, how do you reconcile the fact that your mother was telling this enormous lie that she was an only child with the fact that she was also this kind, loving, and generous person? And my answer is, how many people here have never told a lie? How many people here are proud of everything they've ever done? We're all 2 people, and 3 people, and 4 people. We've all done things. Now, my mother's lie was much more significant than the little white lies that we might tell during the day. My point, though, is that I don't have to reconcile my mother. She was both people. She is any woman who lived in the 1940s and was in the situation that she lived in. My aunt is any woman in the 1940s who was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital and doesn't really have a chance to speak out against that. This is a universal story. I'm going to repeat it. I'm sorry? Well, I'm going to repeat what she said. It was the abandonment of my aunt that she couldn't get around. All readers are right. I mean, if that's what spoke to you, I think a book, for me, a book speaks to me on a level that perhaps it doesn't speak to other people. We all react differently. In my life, things that have happened to me make me respond to parts of books that other people do not respond to. And so if that's what you responded to, you would have the same question that David Olewick's mom had of my mom if you were having a conversation with her, is how could you not go visit your sister after my grandmother died and she had nobody visiting her? It should be clear to everybody, my grandmother visited Annie in Eloise on a regular basis, and David's mother took her to Eloise because my mother, having held the secret, couldn't take her to Eloise. I say couldn't, wouldn't take her to Eloise. It would have revealed the secret, I think. I think my mother was quite burdened by that. I mean, here she is watching her cousin take her to go visit my mother's sister. That must have been my mother was a person who was very sensitive and very aware of how to be a good person. I'm sure she felt like a terrible person in those moments. And yet, the question I have is not how could she do that? That wasn't my question. My question was, how could you continue to do that? What was the power that the secret had over her? My mother didn't control her secret. Her secret controlled her. And that was the shame of my mother's experience, is that she didn't realize what she had created. None of us do. When we make decisions, we don't make them in the moment. I mean, we make them only in the moment. My mother wasn't thinking about how this secret was going to affect her 50 years from now. So that's the understanding that I came to, but I appreciate your being troubled by the fact that she made a decision like that and that it put her in a position of abandoning her sister, if that's the way you saw it. Very good question, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. I welcome you to talk to Steve after the program.
Yeah.
I was a resident, I was a medical student at U of M, and we rotated at the acute care hospital at Eloise. So I lived at Eloise for about 6 months, and we resided in the old psychiatric buildings at Eloise. And so if anybody had experience with the ghosts of Eloise, it would have been myself and some of the other medical students. And another comment, Eloise was not just a psychiatric hospital, it was an acute care hospital from way back for the poor, the people who had no insurance or could not afford the $5 a day that regular hospitals charged. My grandmother had her leg amputated at Eloise for diabetes and ended up dying there. So that's my, and a few years ago, my brother and I went back to Eloise. Everything's gone but one building, and there's a historical plaque there that that commemorates the history of Eloise.
I'm glad you shared that, because in a setting like this, it's very difficult to touch on all of the things that we should touch on, and that's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. I welcome you to talk with Steve or Dana or Richard after the program, and the book is available in the museum shop.